Welcome, everyone. We are here for our Victims of Crime Week panel number one. We're talking grounded realities of RJ and TJ today, and I am so excited to be here with Kate and Tyler. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I wanted to just take a moment to really highlight that this series is about highlighting ways that we can work collaboratively together. And we are focusing on sexual harm and restorative and transformative practices to do that. So, a couple of little housekeeping bits. This is a conversation. This is a conversation that is emerging based on what our sector in the anti-violence sector and in the restorative justice sector is happening right now about intersections and conversations around sexual harm. This is not intended to be a perfect conversation. This is an opportunity to be thinking together and having conversations that are really important to building a foundation together. And so just a asking for grace as we have these conversations from a place of being imperfect and putting things out as we're thinking about them right now. And that might evolve over time. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and those are the guardians of these lands and the stewards of these lands that we have the great privilege of doing our work on. And, making a land acknowledgement is one thing, but connecting it to our work is really important for us at Salal. And so acknowledging that through the colonial process, that sexual harm was used as a tool and an ongoing weapon for maintaining control over people's lives, and that our binary worlds were also introduced through colonialism and are also carceral ones. And so the conversation that I think we can have today is really exciting to think about it also within the context of our duties to decolonize our practices and ourselves. I'll turn it over to you, Tyler, to introduce yourself.
Thanks. Tyler Redsky. I use they, them pronouns. I am a settler. My ancestors on my mother's side come from Ireland, and on my father's side, Sicily, Malta, the Aegean Islands, and the Maghreb. I am, grateful to be here. I think how I'd love to kind of ground myself in the conversation is I'm someone who is a survivor and also someone who's gone on to cause serious harm. So I work from a place, or hopefully I'm working from a place of humility and to create things that I didn't have access to in both aspects of my experience. I'll pass it to you, Kate.
Thanks, Tyler, and thanks, Dahlia. My name is Kate Crozier. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of Community Justice Initiatives in the land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Shinaapan people, also known as Waterloo Region. My background is in anti-violence work and felt raised by some pretty great intersectional feminists who mentored me into doing anti-violence work and then moved into restorative justice about 15 years ago.
Well, I'm going to kick us off with our first question, which is, as practitioners of restorative and or transformative justice, what does the landscape actually look like right now? And whoever feels moved to start us off.
Do you want to go first, Tyler?
Sure, thank you. And also I was secretly hoping you would. I think it's complicated. I mean, I'm from the so-called United States, so I think about it in a larger landscape of both Turtle Island and at large. I think it's nice to name that Interrupting Criminalization did a transformational justice report about the world. And so I really love that resource. And if folks want to kind of know about other projects worldwide that's holding TJ, that's a great space. In terms of RJ, I think one of the main differences I've seen between, the so-called states and Canada is there's a lot more opportunity systemically for restorative justice here. There are just so many more programs. Like in BC alone, I think we're up to like 70-ish programs, and all of those vary. and that restorative justice is available to adults, not necessarily across the board for sexual violence and IPV or any kind of power-based offense, but that there's just a lot more institutionalized. I think what's really similar is that there are very few programs that are doing this work, I think, with an intersectional decolonial liberatory lens in both places, and that we're kind of currently building out the capacity to do the work that we want. And I think struggling through trying to figure out the difference between TJ and RJ, and is that in some ways, and I think it bodes like, is that a meaningful question? I think yes, but I'm sure we'll get into that, like distinction between the two. I think there are a few places that are trying with RJ to figure out what would the system's a weird word, what's the structure look like to hold serious harm, and what are the conditions that we need to make that successful. And I think that's kind of the same, across Turtle Island is, what are the conditions that make accountability possible? What are the conditions that make our projects sustainable? And how do we really deeply root that into community? And I'll say, being newer to so-called Canada for the last 2 years, one thing I see is a really big difference too, is that a lot of the programs that I kind of look up to, like Freedom Community Center, Our Joy, Ahimsa, like these are places in the States, they're really rooted in community. Like these are deeply community-led organizations, and they don't just do RJ and or TJ. Their programs like expand to also serving survivors. Some like Freedom Community Center also gives money to support survivors. They're often led by people who are from that community and like grew up there, which I think is really beautiful, and have a deep, like long-term, often multi-generational understanding of the communities that they're serving, and a vested interest. And I think another way to really bluntly say that is they're often led by BIPOC folks who are most directly affected and who are holding that leadership, which I don't find to be present in Canada, and often led by folks who have lived experience, or are, because of the identities and colonization or racialized capitalism, or hold similar risk to being incarcerated or did at some point in their lives. So they're really speaking to addressing the community problem, because they understand their connection to it. And I think my experience in Canada is that there's been a lot of professionalization and some really beautiful, tangible, like on the ground things that we haven't yet developed often in the States. So I think there's that's kind of, I guess, my entry point into it.
Thanks. Yeah, so speaking from being housed in Ontario, my experience is that heads are turning very much toward restorative justice in a way that just keeps growing and growing. I would say 5 years ago, especially in the gender-based violence field, there was still deep skepticism and some distrust that flowed both ways, right? So from RJ being critical of carceral approaches of people doing anti-violence work, and from people doing anti-violence work being concerned restorative justice was about reconciliation, about forgiveness, didn't really understand how serious sexual harm was. And there's been a real movement toward one another. And that's been a shift from both. So from restorative justice, really spending time understanding feminist intersectional politics, understanding the first harm of colonization and what we need to do to repair that. And from sexual assault centers in particular, like I've just experienced, they have given up on the criminal legal system. They are divesting from spending time in that system. And so they're looking for something else and see possibilities with restorative justice. So that feels really exciting. And also provincially, like there is no provincial investment in restorative justice. So we've taken dollars that were given to us to run groups for survivors of different genders, and saw that was a need already well met in our community. And we just moved those dollars to doing dialogue work. And so there is no funding that comes for that work. So we can support about 3 to 4 cases at a time, which isn't very many. It by no means keeps up with the need. We're also in the conditions in Ontario are that there is a prohibition against courts referring people who have experienced gender-based violence to a restorative process. And so we are only doing community-based cases for people who don't want to engage with that system around that work. Yeah, and I think I'll stop there.
You reminded me, Kate, if I could just add about the specifics too in BC. So I served and am still serving on leave as Executive Director of Restorative Justice Victoria, and we are given pilot funds from the BC government to show that RJ is applicable for power-based offenses.
Mhm.
There's not a moratorium like Ontario. Often it's interesting traveling around the province, I'll see people and they'll tell me there's a moratorium. So I think there's a lot of misinformation. I think that's a really important, even from academics that are doing research and publishing on this work, that will tell me like, no, there is a moratorium. And I'm like, there definitely isn't. And I think one of the ways the government has been not encouraging until there are some clear, from their perspective, guidelines, which is a complicated subject, but that's my understanding, is that all RJ programs, and I don't know if this is the same in Ontario and BC, get a small amount of funding through PSSG, and that also provides insurance. And so basically programs in BC can do sexual violence work, but they have to have their own insurance. And so Crown can refer, that's up to the individual offices, which is its whole own other conversation that maybe we'll touch on, about the level of discretion that Crown holds about moving this work forward or not. But also specifically, there are programs that don't have the funding that we have at Restorative Justice Victoria that are doing this work and have been doing this work, but simply just don't have government insurance for it and don't necessarily have the green light. And so that's kind of the current landscape in BC, is that because I've run into other programs that were like, oh yeah, no, we're doing this work too. And so that's the reality.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add maybe one more thing, Dahlia, before the next question. The pause always helps you think.
Yeah.
I would also say there's a growing understanding that working with people who cause harm is gender-based violence work. And again, that is a massive shift from where we were years ago that felt offensive before to consider that part of gender-based violence work. And now I see an openness, curiosity, and even some pilot projects going out that are being received really well. So in our community here, the shelter for largely women-identified folks fleeing intimate partner violence has now an engaging men program where if the men have been contacted by police 2 times within 3 months, they're invited in, and 100 men have said yes, like I need some help with this. And they're doing a funding model that doesn't compete with the shelter money that they need, and it's really exciting. And the community is embracing this work, and I've never seen that before. And that makes me really hopeful because we've worked with people who've caused sexual harm here for decades in group work. And certainly we did that on the down low because it was not received the way things are now.
Yeah, I'm always so interested in considering unintended consequences for things. And part of the presentations that I end up doing when talking about like why we've chosen at Salal to engage in thinking about kind of reimagining justice is what we call it, that maybe blend between RJ and TJ, is that, I really do feel that in the 80s and early 90s, it was a huge feat to convince people that sexual violence and intimate partner violence was an issue that people should care about, and that should be taken seriously, and that should be, from like a morality perspective in Canada, included in the criminal code and all of those things. And so I think watching that turn into this like deep commitment to carcerality has largely been because people are like hustling for worthiness around like ensuring that their experiences are being acknowledged as serious and harmful and worthy of systemic like attention. And then like that evolution also needs to be happening where we're thinking about whether carcerality has become an answer to like changing behavior and like stopping people from causing more harm in the future. Because, still today, when I meet with survivors, the number one thing that people want is for that person who's harmed them to not go on to hurt other people. And so really like digging into whether putting people in jail or putting them through a trial process is actually getting to that, I think is like an important evolution of of where we have to go as a sector. So
I had read articles for a long time, but I got to hear recently at Collective Justice, which is another amazing org in the States that does both RJ and TJ work deeply rooted in community. Um, Mimi Kim did a talk about the carceral creep. And I think that that phrasing really just like sums up like the movement of anti-violence and the creeping in of carceral values and what we lost and why, and kind of like does it. I think she always speaks from such a grounded place of like, you know, even with the best of intentions, what did we lose through that process and
right.
where are we now?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I feel like there's a natural segue to just invite you both to maybe think about our next question, which is how do you define um RJ and TJ? Is there a delineation for you between the two, you know, deeply acknowledging that like restorative justice was often seen as like being initiated and practiced by Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island since the beginning of time, and that TJ as like praxis came out of African American communities in the US, and what you were saying, Tyler, about like that motivation of finding the antidote to the like prison pipeline, that this is about people like saving communities and families. But there is a reality that these modalities have been maybe co-opted, maybe being, you know, encouraged to be used in systemic ways now or professionalized. And like, how do we keep tabs on how those things are happening, and how would you define them right now?
Yeah, this question gives me existential dread. We swirl around these questions all the time to no perfect resolution. I think what I'm really curious about is what the justice traditions on this land were prior to colonization. I'm really curious about that, and that's not easy to find. And so we're invested in learning what that is or was. So at CJI, when we have these conversations, because we are legally a restorative justice organization, our history comes from court-referred cases through the victim offender program. And now that is like a small piece of what we do. We do so much community-based referrals. We want to be here for anyone in community who's experienced harm, whether it meets a legal threshold or not, that chooses this as their way of repair. And so most of our work has nothing to do with the criminal legal system. So we like, what does that mean then? And our work is done by community volunteers. Are we a TJ organization, actually? And so I think, of course, like where an institution has a finger in our work, we would never call that TJ work. So, you know, we're the Crown attorneys are determining the pace at which cases need to happen and what needs to come back to them. I would call that our RJ work, but still more complicated. We go into the prison and we bring a pile of volunteers in once a week to build relationships to help with the reintegration that comes after. And the prison defines a bit of what we do. So what is that? Is that RJ? Is that TJ? I don't know. So that's a question we continue to explore. I think the most important thing is, as an organization, none of us want to be limited in one box or the other. You know, if people are doing RJ, they care about TJ. And like if their work is that victim offender repair, they have a big interest in making sure that system change happens. And even though their casework might not allow for that, they're participating in that work in other ways. And for people doing system change work, they also want to make sure people have experiences of repair and that anyone going through the criminal legal system has an off ramp to get out of that system if they want it. So it just blurs big time over here.
I love a lot of the things you were saying too, Kate, because I think, you know, when I started really trying to understand the difference, and for me, there's like a personal trajectory and timeline, but I think one of the ways that I find this question useful is that the TJ values can really, and I think have worked to shift RJ, have to like bring it into an intersectional frame, a liberatory frame, right? Because my understanding, it's interesting, Dahlia, like I came up as a I'm a mixed person who was trans and queer. I was houseless at 15. And so I didn't understand that how we moved, where it was like, no matter what happened to you, didn't call the police. And that's TJ, right? Because from a very, like, not political yet at all, but it was like, if you call the cops, you'll be hurt. And that was the understanding. So, like, knowing that if you're a youth on the streets of New York, even if you were assaulted, you'll probably get arrested for something, or a citation or a ticket, or just a horrible, horrible experience. And so to me, that was the TJ value, is like, we don't, and I think that's really where you're speaking to, is that it came out of this place of like trans, mostly BIPOC led, specifically trans, queer, sex worker, street involved, drug using folks who were like, we need to figure something else out because the system is absolutely not safe for us. And I think because of that, it really beautiful organizers, community organizers were able to say, like, let's use TJ as a way to look at community, kind of came out of community justice too, that, or like, justice processes, alternative justice processes. It got a name and a movement behind it. Like you said, that largely came out of the United States. I think of restorative justice specifically as taking, indigenous practices, both on Turtle Island and also all over the world, pre-colonization, how harm was dealt with before there was criminality. Um, and that Howard Zier basically like professionalized it, and then people started to go to study it, to like really heavily connected both to the system but also to academia. And then I think people started, like Fania Davis with Our Joy, started to like really like tease out and bring back the core values. And I think Kate, like CJI is a perfect example of like such amazing work, and then it gets a little bit muddy because like you have the values and you're doing community work and you're deeply rooted to community, but then also we have these ties to the system. And for me, the clarity is, and I learned a lot of this from Shira Hassan, it's like, you can't do TJ if you're, and I think that there's importance to this, and I'm not the authority on it, but I love talking about it because it's like we can do, I bring my TJ values when I work in schools, but because those are places of mandated reporting, I'm not actually doing TJ, right? And so if I am a mandated reporter, if I am getting grants, if I am like fiscally bound in these ways, I'm not really doing TJ because I'm always moving in some sort of compromised way. And I think being honest about those contradictions, but I hold those, and Kate, you articulated this, these transformational justice values, these decolonial, anti-racist, community values. And I think that that's the benefit. And I think that what we've seen is that some of the programs like yours have developed a really beautiful structure that, messy TJ queers and communities haven't necessarily gotten to. And so how can this conversation be built up that we can learn from some of the learnings that somewhat institutionalized RJ processes, or communities that had a lot of funding, a lot of really amazing folks go through there, and have done the work to integrate feedback and create new structures. So we've moved away just from kind of the Howard Zier model of, I would say, vaguely appropriative like circle talk without grounding into like systemic problems and realities. I think that, yeah, then it gets more interesting. So that's kind of how I look at it. And I think it's important that folks that are not able to do TJ work fully say that, because I think one of the things I've seen people on kind of the organizing community space get worried about is like what happened to the term, at least in the States, of harm reduction, and how the government kind of came in and like took that, right? And so then now we're like, oh, this is liberatory harm reduction, which is really important over here. But then harm reduction, like at least back home in Maine, like public health was using that, right? In a totally different way than like community-led orgs were talking about. And so I think that it's like, some of the harm reduction orgs, for instance, in Toronto, that are doing amazing work, especially for Indigenous communities, they're not doing the same thing that harm reduction became in Maine through the public health. And so I think I'm worried. I've seen it actually a lot more in Canada, like RJ orgs interchangeably use that. And I'm like, I think it's important to say we have those values, but we're not doing TJ because at the end of the day, if we're a mandated reporter, we can't, I don't believe, do TJ if we have to report.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why we changed our project pilot title to Reimagining Justice, because it felt like, yeah, it felt like RJ options as far as like supporting letter writing and dialogues and, all of those pieces that kind of come out of the traditions of RJ mixed with like a TJ value. So looking at the conditions that allowed caused harm to happen, and how can we focus on those community-based um, changes that people wanted to see. So whether it was, doing workshops for community where harm took place, and whether the person that caused the harm ever knew about anything. And so trying to reimagine what justice could look like for survivors. So thank you for that. Okay. So, picking up on a thread that you just mentioned, Tyler, our next question is that we often talk about models, RJ, TJ, as kind of quote unquote alternatives to the criminal legal system. But in practice, I'm curious about both your thoughts on whether that's actually a useful way to think about RJ or TJ, given what y'all have said so far.
Do you want to go first, Kate? Or
Sure. I just have a brief thought on that. And it's really that I've done so much more RJ in my life than I have at work. And so uh, that is that's my lived experience of it. I've participated in more dialogues around harm that have happened because I've caused harm or because I've been harmed or because I've witnessed harm in my life than I have facilitated cases as a paid professional at CJI. And so that in that way, the word alternative doesn't fit for me. It is because I don't care about the criminal threshold. I don't think any of us care about the criminal threshold of harm in the way that is not going to define how we respond to it. And like there also, if we are talking about RJ in relation to the criminal legal system, I have no problem with talking about it as an alternative at this point, because the reality is there is so much resistance to referring people to RJ. It is by far like an exception that people are getting referred to us, and it's not the mainstream. It is an alternative in that system, just not in my life.
I don't think I said this when I was reading the question, that I really appreciated it. And it helped me. I was looking at a post recently around, like, on a more kind of meta level, that when we're in survival mode, it's easier for us to talk about the things we don't want than it is for the things we want. And I remember too, when I was first transitioning, I was like 16 years old. I'm 43. So this was like, 2000. So the presence and like dialogue and like literature was just nil around trans folks. And it was mostly just cis folks theorizing about us in like not great anthropological ways. And I remember, so I had this professor who asked me, like, how would you define being trans? And I was saying all the things I wasn't, because that's what I could understand is I'm not this and I'm not that and it's not this. And she pointed that out to me. She was a Black queer woman who's Demetria Royal, is an amazing woman. Taught me a lot about just saying the truth. Said very strong, amazing things that, yeah, forever grateful for. And that really stuck with me. And I wasn't able to do it then. And so I think that maybe we're at that new threshold right now. And I don't know that we're there, but it's like, how do we move past that? And I think that that's where really like the amazing, like, beyond resilience and gift that Indigenous communities have held on to, all like other ways of holding harm. And I always talk about it as like remembering how to hold harm differently, right? Because we all have this in our lineages, pre-colonization, pre-witch trials, pre-torture and harm. So, and I've seen other like really amazing Black practitioners talk about for white folks, right? It's like, try to remember in your lineage, before whiteness was coded for power, what your people did when someone was sick, right? And I think it's similar, right? It's like, how did we come together? How do we reimagine different forms of justice? Because I believe that this is a community process, a community endeavor. I think it's also deeply spiritual in a lot of ways, because it's like, how do we want to be responded to when we're hurt? And I think that project has changed because the conditions are very different, right? Remembering how harm was held pre-colonization is different because colonization has caused so much harm. and it's gone on for so many hundreds of years that the systems will need to be different. The values will be the same, but there's a lot more for these processes to hold, right? Because so much more has been done, like unimaginable harm for hundreds of years that we have to together dream up new processes. Like, how do you hold processes for enslavement of people and racism and like Jim Crow era? Like, those are processes that didn't exist before colonization. So I think we both need to remember, and then I think we need to re-articulate new rituals, ceremonies, processes, practices that can hold all of that. And no, I don't think always framing it as an alternative, but also like on a less existential tip, right? If that's going to get you in the door to do diversion work, to work with your people, like do it. Do you know what I mean? Like, do it. Like, you got to read the room. You know, I'm not always great at that, not my strength, but I think if you can, it's important. But I think it robs us of the larger project, which I believe all of us on this call are deeply invested in, right? Is like, and I think that's just different folks with different skills on different timelines, right? Like, we need people in all aspects, like people doing the diversion work while our people are being harmed in the systems, in circles in prisons, the diversion pipeline, the imagining before abolition project, the future projects, the past and the repair of the past harms, like all of that is connected. And also we can't all do it all. So
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you both for that. I think being in sexual harm spaces like so deeply, obviously for the past 21 years, this is where I've been. Um, I do really resonate with what you were saying, Kate, around just like that this is like a life practice. And there are many of us that have lost those traditions or those teachings, to your point, Tyler. And I worry sometimes, not about the relevancy of using RJ for sexual harm, but what are the pieces that people need to turn their minds to about having like practices and personal insight, on both all sides, in order to turn, to this modality for particularly for sexual harm. And I think that so much of colonization has detached us from ourselves and each other, and that, attachment work is very much like at the center of how you make repair. And so, yeah, I think there's like so many different kind of edges that we need to get used to practicing, and that it is a spiritual, it's like a whole embodied, practice that we need to be getting and like building capacity for with each other and our communities and ourselves.
I think that gets at like a spicy question too, Dahlia, around like honesty. Like, I think that often,
Yeah.
like on the left, where a lot of these conversations happen, people aren't really honest about. I mean, I can speak that my growing up in a public school system in New York, like I was deeply, especially as an American, we are so deeply indoctrinated with carcerality. Like, I was like,
Mm.
yeah, death penalty makes sense. Like, I thought that for many years, because I was like, they're bad people and they're so bad that that's how you get safety, and not a lot of political education. And I think that on a deep, deep level, we're not really honest yet around how like committed we are to punishment, like really deeply committed we are on a psychological level to like not fully letting go of like, if you do something bad you have to pay that price. And I think that that also really holds up the work on a big level.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, agreed. Um, well, this is a bit of a segue to our next conversation, which is like there seems to be a growing kind of swell, of RJ and or TJ principles, being used, specifically to address sexual harm. Why do you both think that people are turning to this or considering this or like deeply advocating for it right now?
You want to go first this time, Tyler?
Sure. Every time I'm like, thank you, and then so
Good
much
to
easier
know.
to go off another person. Um, I think, a lot of it is the trajectory, right? I think that there was so much work done, and a lot of really bravery around Me Too and getting like public visibility out. And I think one, our media landscape has changed, right? Like that's irrevocably different. We all have so much more access to different forms of media, especially social media. So people's stories are able to get out more. I think a lot of survivors have continued to do huge amounts of work. Like I think about like Chanel Miller's Know My Name and like those kind of like narratives getting like a big reach and seeing, how even in her case, when you're one of the very few percent that actually make it to trial, how sentencing doesn't really serve you. And then also what comes of that afterwards, right? Like, that person who deeply harmed her has never been accountable and has refused all forms of accountability, but was punished. And I think that when we reckon with how few people have ever get served, and then understand kind of the futility of that, and then see also um, the like rampant, incredible like violence that's so epidemic and sadly so common and in our everyday, and right because of all of the news, like in a lot of people's supposedly safest relationships. And I think that combination has just pushed the conversation into the forefront in an undeniable way, right? Like we've stopped, the argument really can't be posed as that it's just a few people anymore. Like we've seen so many horrific news stories that make this so relevant that it's an epidemic and it's here, and it's we all know people that are harmed by these things and harmed in these ways, that I think it's really pushed the system inadequate way to handle harm, to the forefront. And so I think that that's creating a conversation, of what else is possible. And I think there have been a few organizations that have managed to be doing this work that, don't have like that have done it successfully. And so people are starting to just be like, what about here? What about here? I think we were still really missing the ability to like pull it all together in a cohesive narrative. And I think this conversation is great for that, to be like, what is the actual landscape, or who is doing this?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Um, in Ontario, we had the Hockey Canada trial, which had, I think national attention. And I think um, the nuance of the harm that happened in that case, I think it was obvious to most of us that a criminal trial can't handle that. And that is so typical of experiences of harm, where there is harm happened, and did it meet the criminal legal threshold is so unimportant to addressing that survivor's needs. I mean, she chose to go through the criminal legal process, and I wish she'd got the justice she was looking for, and that system just couldn't handle, yeah, the nuance of that. And then we had the Sloka trial here, and I'm not sure if that has made its way across your ways, but so this is a neurologist who about 15 years ago, 70 people, mostly women identified folks, came forward and said that they'd experienced harm. The medical board revoked his license because there was enough evidence. And then over this like 5-year trial where 48 survivors participated, um, was found not guilty on all charges. And the judge said, like, didn't even say the Crown didn't make a good enough case. He said, I don't believe these survivors. They weren't credible, these 48 people. Um, and, I was saying to a colleague of mine, I've never felt in my bones how my body's unsafe the way a trial like that resonated. And so I think that's creating ripples of understanding. Like I named already, there's divestment from the criminal legal system from sexual assault centers, but I think beyond that, that message is having people interested in what restorative justice can offer. I also really appreciate people that I've learned from who model like the removal of the binaries from like survivor offender. And I mean, Tyler, you did that in your introduction, and there's others, and I'm trying to model that myself. That yeah, like I grew up not in consent culture, so it's very possible that someone could come forward and say I caused harm, right? Like it's very possible without knowing that now. And I've really appreciated that modeling, that we aren't like so far apart from being either this or this, that more likely like we are this in our lives. And that just seems to like lower the I don't know what the word is, um, the fear around this work, to just normalize that we could be on either side of these dialogues at some point in our lives. And so I see like our sexual assault center here has made a big shift now to where they were formerly turning away anyone who named they'd caused sexual harm. They're now working with folks who are survivors who've also caused harm, because they still need survivor work very, very much. And that's a really big shift. And I'm not sure if that's happening in other places across Canada, but I'm excited about that. And then finally, I just wanted to name the work of Survivors for Justice Reform, and how they have just brought people around the world together and say, when you're calling for punishment, you're not talking about me, like you're misrepresenting me and my needs. And like, just hats off to them under Marley's leadership. But each person I've met connected to that coalition is such a champion for naming what their healing and justice needs are, and they're not punishment.
Yeah, that's thank you for bringing Marley into the conversation, and also the Survivors for Justice Reform. I thought, hope that there would be a space to kind of bring that in, because I think, right, that shows like all over people are able to name and articulate like the fundamental flaw, many fundamental flaws, but one of them being um, that, right, that you become a witness to your own experience and that you have no say in what happens after that. And I remember very clearly at a case at RJV that one of the people that came through was sharing with the doctor, and the doctor, they're mandated reported, right, and did not want to be in the criminal legal system. And so RJ was an exit ramp for this person to get off this trajectory that was started for them. I also just wanted to name, Kate, because you made me think of this, and Dahlia, the way that you said it in the beginning, specifically to the tireless work of Indigenous people advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit, right? Like Audrey Huntley's work with No More Silence, and just everyone naming the connection between colonial violence, specifically forms of sexual violence, and man camps, right? And the refusal for any like centering and justice that the criminal legal system here and in the United States will purposely like underserve, despite reports and recommendations and committees and commissions, right? And so I think that that's really important to name it, because they face the highest rates of sexual violence of anyone. And I think that um, continued advocacy and community building, and then I think again of Audrey's work with No More Silence, to hold the complexity of when you're experiencing the most harm, also grappling with the questions of abolition, right? And like the criminal legal system isn't the solution, and yet what do we do when our people are being murdered, right, and harmed? And I think that that leadership and that kind of brilliant vision is so important.
And I think another reason why the like many menu options is also so important, because, as I mentioned earlier, I think that that need to claim and prove worthiness within our systems and the governance that we do have in our nations under colonization, that is one determination about how much of full human status you do get under our current systems, right? And so it makes also perfect sense to me why Indigenous communities continue to push for accountability through carceral responses, because you know, there is like a deep and significant variation of how people are over surveilled and under protected,
Yeah.
particularly for women, girls, and two-spirit people within our communities. And now, conversations are starting to arise about missing Indigenous boys and men as well. And so, yeah, I think a variation of tactics is definitely still an important thing that we have to wrestle with in our communities, for sure.
I think to that point too, Dahlia, like the RJ can serve for Indigenous communities as another form of carcerality, right? Because it can be like outsiders, even if they're not
Yes.
directly coming
Yes.
into communities, often
Mhm.
white, often retired, you know, with like totally different values in politics and like the kind of savior mentality or second chance mentality and come in and do a lot of harm.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that that's also a really important distinction of, you know, again, that where is the RJ program rooted? Like, are these actual community members dealing with harm in community, or is this an outside organization coming in?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
really different.
Yeah. For sure. And yeah, thank you both for naming Marley and all of the vulnerability and work and emotional labor that survivors for justice reform and survivors all around the world are doing to put themselves out there. I think, sharing our stories as survivors, also as a survivor myself, I think is like an important process. And um, it can be a lot at the same time when there is not always something that allows you to see the type of justice or healing that you're wanting to see. And so, yeah, deep respect to all those folks. Okay, I have one last question for us. Um, and that is transformative justice asks us to look at root causes and broader systems, not just individual harm. What conditions actually need to be in place for that to happen in real world settings?
Hmm. This is a challenging question, Dahlia, for me at least. Um, so I'll do my best on this. And I'd say it depends on folks in this work who are leaning, like their TJ is lean toward abolition or significant system change, right? And so um, I think at CJI we have folks with both approaches here. Um, and so maybe I'll talk about significant system change first. Um, yeah, so we want the way policing is done in this community to be different. And we are only able to do that through some relationship. And so that's hard because people have had really dangerous relationships with police. And so relationship isn't something that is safe for lots of people to do. And there are some folks here who are willing and open to doing that work. And we've had no change. It has resulted in no change for how policing is done here. And so, we grapple with that question because um, we know that officers are overwhelmed by what they are tasked with doing. We know that it results in massive amounts of harm. And we know we have something to offer in that process. And yet there's just this wall to doing anything differently. This region used to have a crime prevention council, which was about 40 representatives of community organizations that came together to tackle an issue. And it was pretty effective because the people who needed to be at that's not true. I'm sure it always excluded people. There were decision makers at that table that could get things shifted and changed. And then that got defunded by our region. And so everyone's scattered. Everyone's now competing for resources, competing for a voice, a seat at the table, competing for their objective to move forward rather than working as a coalition together. That's my ramblings on that topic. Tyler, save me on this one.
I mean, I think again, like I think it's the question is both for like RJ with TJ values, so like systems change work, and then the project of TJ as abolition. And I think like again, for me at least, just coming from the States, like I see TJ as like intrinsically in order to be an integrity, like an abolitionist project. And you can have different parts of TJ values, but at its root, it's about abolition. And so I think I'll like maybe change the question a little bit to be like, Kate, what you were saying, I also deeply see where it's like, yes, the funding issues, the that's not sustainable. It's like why one of the organizations that I went to work with were like, yeah, a sexual assault center was like, we would refer to you, but we need to know that you have sustainable funding because we don't want to bring a survivor to you and then have your funding like out and then you can't do it in the middle of a process or it's so that's just real. I think on a TJ as an abolitionist project, I think one ecosystems, right? Like we need in order for it to work, we need non-carceral crisis response lines, right? Because you want to avoid the police being called in the first place. And that's a totally different skill set than, and we were talking about this before we recorded, so we can kind of maybe revive it and then Kate, I'd love you to fill in too about this, but it's like the timeline is different, right? It's like so right when the crisis happens, who do you call that's not the police, and how do you build up that fluency in community and also resource it? Because it's exhausting work. It can be dangerous work. It's a very specific set of skills. Um, and then, right, you need to resource people so that right after a crisis, they're supported enough to kind of get out of that crisis so that then some sort of community justice process can happen, right? Where then the person who's getting, caused harm is being asked, like, what do you need? What to have made a different decision? A lot of education on learning together. The survivor, the person who was harmed, is also supported in processing what happened to them, understanding what they would have needed. And then even after that, like I think this is a huge distinction between TJ and RJ, is that TJ processes take really long time. And even a long RJ process, which is impressive, at least I feel impressed at RJV. I don't know that your timeline for CJI, I think it's similar. The longer cases will find somehow on a shoestring the ability to work with people for like a year to 2 years, which is incredible for a small nonprofit with under like we had under $500,000 budget. That's how do you do that for multiple people and meet with them weekly or biweekly for 2 years? That's wild and impressive. And then the follow up, right? Because Shannon Perez Darby, a friend of mine who runs Accountable Communities and does a lot of beautiful work with mandated reporting, she also has a great podcast. And in one of her episodes, she was like, in order to be accountable, it's like accountable to who? This is a relationship project. So then how do you have the follow up and the follow through in the community that's resourced enough to, without being carceral or surveilling, like be in relationship with someone? Like, as I said, I caused harm. My partner, my friends, mentors, these are all people that make sure, not in a surveillance way, but because they care about me, that I'm not causing harm, right? And that they're giving me advice. I have mentors and elders that I go to that are like, I'm like, hey, I had this conflict. What should I look at? To make sure I'm not, yeah, harming myself or harming other people, which is a form of harming myself. And I think of it too with reps, like the work of Resma Manikem, of like, how do we build up the collective capacity to do this work? Again, going to that, like, so that we can discern between discomfort and unsafety, like somatic feelings of unsafety versus material conditions of unsafe, because that is really challenging to work with people on all ends of the spectrum of harm. And then change the structural conditions. Arjoy Tiasha Bankhead, who is amazing, the ED of Arjoy, I remember saying like, sometimes justice looks like a hotel room for the night for a survivor who needs to get away or a meal. Like, how do we expand that vision? So I think for me, it's kind of all of those things. But I think we just, again, we don't have the resources yet to really think through these things. Like, again, that timeline piece. It's like we know that RJ can't happen or TJ right after the crisis, but something should, right? You don't just want people like floating, because if they really had the tools and conditions, the harm probably wouldn't, I believe, wouldn't have happened, right, in the first place. So what do we do between that moment and the process? How do we build in all those things?
Beautiful. Yeah. I think these are the pieces that I really hope that we would get to, because I think, to your point earlier, Kate, like the underestimation of needing to have this as a practice for life. Like you know, Tyler, what you just said, like our governments, our systems are not investing in people. They're investing in like responses that are deeply rooted in punishment and carcerality, or supporting people to navigate those systems that are not working for them. Um, but given that we generally work on government 4-year cycles, like we can't invest in humans in that way, and have like deeply embedded skill building, when we don't work from like a restorative or transformative place in our schools, or in our, religious institutions, or in our families. And so that is my concern always, of like the hopping on a different train because something else isn't working. And in this case, like, everybody starting to look at RJ as like the answer that's going to create healing or justice for people, without really acknowledging that, like, yeah, if somebody that's caused harm doesn't have anywhere to sleep tonight, doesn't know where their next meal is, has no attachment with people in their life or their community, doesn't really care about themselves because of maybe their own survivorship. Like how does one start to consider accountability, or see harming somebody else as also harming themselves? It becomes an impossible project. And so yeah, really grateful for both of your insight on like just the expansiveness um that all of us should be dreaming towards. And like how do we, yeah, embed these things more into like the longevity of our life. Our next panel actually is going to be about, yeah, how do we start practicing restorative and transformative justice principles in our lives, before like quote unquote harm has happened, but like how do we start embedding those things? And so inviting folks that are watching to check that out as well. Um, we are at time. And I just want to give you both an opportunity to kind of put any little bows on anything, if anything's lingering, or the questions didn't get at something that you were hoping to leave here today. Um, and also just like, how are you feeling about the conversation? And yeah, any last thoughts?
Maybe I'll share. There's no like coalition of people who practice this work that is like exists that you just kind of sign up and belong to. And so as RJ and TJ practitioners, we float around, and I mean, Tyler, you always model, and you too, Dahlia, like intentional connection and getting to know one another. And yet I can often feel very disconnected even from people practicing in Ontario. And whenever I do have these connections, it makes me just really proud and honored to be part of the work uh, that is happening around Turtle Island, North America. Um, and yeah, appreciate the naming that you did, Tyler, about the contributors that that you've learned from, others have learned from, I've learned from, because there's yeah, I think, RJ, from CJI's perspective, or history, I should say, a lot of arrogance around where this work came from and us holding it, and really historically negated the voices of racialized, Indigenous, and queer communities. What they've been saying for a long time wasn't working for them, what they needed, and what people were doing for themselves. And so I'm really glad you brought that into the conversation today.
Thanks. Yeah, I again also want to express, Kate, similar to you, the gratitude. It is the thing that, despite all of the other hardships, keeps me going, is the conversations like these. Like I got to go down to Seattle and meet the folks at Collective Justice and others, and recently, and just have a conversation, like an all-day conversation around like how do we define accountability, right? And it was so life-giving. And I think for me, it's like, again, that kind of points to another thing we need, which is like spaces that aren't necessarily conferences, right? That are around like, how do we have a retreat, right? Where we're like actually resource, we're not, it's not performance, it's not that that's disingenuous, but right, it's like for us, by us, to kind of work through things together and learn from each other so that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. Because at that event, Kate, I was like talking about CGI and was like, you should all look up this work and talk to these folks. And same with you, Dahlia. And it's like, you're at Salal. And so for me, I think that again, like moving away from any sort of like ego or proprietorship, like we really run off the rails when we do that and people get on like the speaker circuit, you know, or the like only books. Like books are great and it's like how you're holding it, you know, and why you're doing it. And I think for me, yeah, like those are the things that we really do need is so that we can share the things that we've developed that we're working on, that we have stuck points. And yeah, I think that again, one of the biggest things I've seen that I find hard about working up here in Canada is that I remember there's a person who's, you know, does great work, has been doing this work for a long time, is highly regarded as an RJ practitioner, um, written a lot. And I remember I introduced, and I know you, Kate, you all at CJI, and I remember writing you about this because we didn't, RJV had a policy to not hire or have people on the board with lived
Mm.
experience. And that was like the first thing that I hit when I worked in, where I was like, oh, this is so different than the so-called states, right? Like we often, I think it's really important to have survivors and people that have caused harm and people that have caused harm that are also survivors because we understand what it is to be impacted by these systems or at risk. Or, you know, when we're talking about gang violence, I'm like, that's not a thing that I should speak to or necessarily have that much to offer someone who is moving in that way because it's not a reality I faced. um, Sex work, street involved, trans folks, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, like yes, that's my wheelhouse. And I think that it's important to name this. But this person, so I introduced a friend of mine who, it was a CSA case, who was a practitioner. And this person was like, I'm worried about having someone with lived experience on the case because of a lack of objectivity. And I was shocked, where I was like, objectivity, it doesn't exist. And B, like, whole, when we've moved through the harm, I believe that we as practitioners really hold a distinct knowledge that we can share. And I watch like a somatic release when I talk to another person who's caused harm, who's like, oh, you understand in your body what it is to hold these things and how do you create relationships with people that you can, you know, never repair with. And I don't think we're the only ones that can do this work, but I think that it's really important,
Mm.
and I appreciate that being named, is like, how do we make space for more BIPOC leadership in RJ, specifically in Canada, right? How do we make space for more folks that are survivors, their voices to be heard within RJ, people that have caused harm, um, break down that binary too, and make that reality something we can tolerate. Um, because yeah, I think that it's going to hold us back unless we do that. And I think RJ has remained a lot more within academic or professional spheres often in Canada. And I am like interested to see the breakdown. I think CGI is doing that work really well and kind of leading it. Like it was who I went to ask about like, how do you make more space for others to hold the work?
Thanks.
Well, sending a big thank you to the Department of Justice Canada for supporting us to have these conversations this week for Victims of Crime Awareness Week, and sending you both big gratitude and yeah, just really grateful for all that you both put out into the world and the ways that you also move in spaces. So I hope you both have a beautiful day and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.